Hello, and welcome to Owlvideogaming. This is episode 13, Lucky 13. With my luck, this episode is going to be plagued with technical problems, and I'm not going to be able to upload it, and I'm going to have to scrap it altogether. But, here goes. The Sega Megadrive was originally released as the Megadrive in Japan as early as 1988, just about 3 years after the Sega Mk III, its predecessor, was launched in Japan. It was then launched in America in 1989 as the Sega Genesis, and then in 1990 again as the Megadrive in Europe, Australia, and Brazil. With this, Sega was attempting to compete originally with the NES, bragging about how it was much more powerful, how it was 16-bit rather than 8-bit, which is what the NES was, and at the time, very few people who played on consoles had any idea what bits were, but suddenly it was the most important thing in the world. This is 16-bit rather than the 8-bit NES, it makes it much better. What is a bit? I don't know, but it makes a console better. So this wasn't the first 16-bit console, but it was the first major 16-bit console. Later, when the Super Nintendo launched, a few years later, Nintendo's 16-bit console, the competition became really fierce. Again, with Sega claiming they had blast processing, which made it much better than the Super Nintendo. In fact, people still argue nowadays if blast processing really exists, if it's a real thing, or if it was just a fancy term that Sega invented. The Mega Drive was in fact very slightly faster than the Super Nintendo, but the Super Nintendo beat it by a long shot in every other technical aspect. But such is the nature of advertising. There was just this one tiny aspect in which Sega's console was better, and they made it the entire center of their ad campaign. So, though the Mega Drive was initially successful, and Mega Drive games were outselling NES games, the Super Nintendo then launched and stole the show. In fact, though the Super Nintendo got a late start in the 16-bit era, it sold roughly 20 million more units, I think, than the Sega Mega Drive. So, without further ado, the console. So, the Sega Mega Drive. This is the original European release model. Now, if you compare this to the NES, the console was originally competing against, the NES is grey and boxy. This is black and smooth and slim. It was in fact marketed as a much cooler console, and it was aimed at an older audience. This had a presumably intentional twofold effect. So it was marketed at teens and young adults, with more sports games and more violent games, and it was marketed towards them in ads. So this meant that kids wanting to be cool, like teens, were also attracted to this console because it was the cool console. So it even has some practically useless but aesthetically awesome detailing. This thing here, the circle here, and the general shape of the console. Now, if you look here, there's a headphone jack, which was pretty good, a good thing to have. There's a volume slider for the headphones, and here there's an on-off slider. Now I say slider because it's not exactly a switch. It doesn't click straight to on or off. It slides there, which is a bit weird, but it works fine. The reset button, similarly, is a bit small and a bit squishy. It feels weird, but it works fine. So, the controller. Now this also was made to look cool. It looks awesome, and it even has some shaping, a groove at the back to make it more comfortable and to help you grip it. It has an 8-way D-pad, 3 buttons, the A button, the B button, and the C button, and a start button. Now, interestingly, compared to the NES controller, this has the same amount of inputs, because although it has an A, B, and C button, it has A, B, and C buttons, and the NES only has an A button and a B button, the NES controller also has a select button, while this only has a start button. Now, this is a third-party controller. this is largely the same, but also has turbo buttons for A, B, and C. Now, if you don't know what a turbo button is, if you press turbo A, it sends an input as if you're really quickly tapping the A button. Now, interestingly, the controller cable on this is rather short and not at all flexible. This improves upon that by making a longer and more flexible cable. But this means you can't get too far from the console. In fact, I wouldn't be able to play on the console where it's normally placed on my collection because the controller cable is too short. So, now a cartridge. This is Sonic the Hedgehog 2. This was the system's killer app. So the cartridges, again, like with their previous console, are smaller and more compact than their Nintendo counterpart. There's nothing much to say. It's black, continuing the theme of black, to appear cooler. Also, it has a specific shape down here that fits perfectly into the cartridge slot here, so only properly shaped cartridges can be played. So it goes in like this, and you actually have to press it down a bit to get it to go in. But now you're ready to play. And there's even this groove at the back to help you grip it to pull it out. So now I'm going to be playing Sonic the Hedgehog 2. So, onto the game. Okay, so Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Let's go. So, you can see the graphics are very colorful and very detailed. This was Sega showing off the power of the Mega Drive, and it was powerful. The gameplay is massively improved compared to Sonic the Hedgehog on Master System. It's awesome. There's even more of a focus on speed. It's very fast-paced, there's loops and all sorts of tricks. The only problem is that this game can get a little too cinematic, a little too showy, and there's not enough control. It focuses on them so much, the gameplay is almost obsessed with its high-speed shenanigans. And I got an extra life. There's some rather unfair parts where you don't have enough time to react and you end up losing all of your rings. But overall, the gameplay is much more solid than Sonic the Hedgehog on Master System. Now the boss fight is nothing special, you just avoid Dr. Eggman and jump on him. And now you free some of the animals he has captured. And that's the point of the game, really. So, that was the Sega Megadrive. An awesome console, and like the Atari 2600 and the NES, it very significantly contributed to what gaming is today by targeting an older audience and having more violent games. Though it was initially successful, and in fact, at Christmas, 4 years in a row, Sega Megadrive games outsold Nintendo games, it was eventually overwhelmed by the Super Nintendo, which had generally superior hardware and eventually a larger game library. This defeat would start Sega on a path of bad decisions and a loss of popularity that eventually led to them stopping making consoles. Now, interestingly, during the Mega Drive's run, Sega actually made several hardware expansions, such as the Mega CD and the 32X, meant to help it compete against the Super Nintendo's superior hardware. But they didn't really work, owing mainly to their high price point and the low number of good games for them. So, next time, the heat is on as the competition really begins, with the release of the Super Nintendo, which started a massive war fought on the airwaves and store shelves. So, next time, it's the Super Nintendo. But for now, thanks for watching, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and goodbye.